Professor Simon Levin. Simon is a distinguished scholar. He has collected so many prizes. If I would start to count them, probably we will spend our 1 hour slot, so I will not do that, Simon. I will only tell you that he is long ally, long friend of IIASA. He has been chairing IIASA Council for 5 years. He has been vice chair of IIASA Council until day before yesterday. He is a IIASA honorary scholar, and he's a great thinker in the evolution, ecology, and system thinking. Simon is a professor at Princeton University. He's chairing institute there, and he's giving lectures all around the world. And one of the best lectures probably will follow in the next 15, 20 minutes. Simon, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you very much, Pavel. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. The modeling of environmental systems is not new. It has a rich history, goes back certainly 100 years to Vito Volterra. And the classical approaches to this subject, following from the work of people like Volterra, are embedded in dynamical systems theory, which remains an important part of the subject and an important part of IIASA, optimization approaches, control theory, and a focus to a large extent, despite Volterra's work, on single species, especially, for example, in the management of fisheries. Perhaps 2 decades ago, this document came out from the US National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council on Sustaining Marine Fisheries, arguing for an ecosystem approach, and you'll hear many calls for systems approaches to the management of marine systems and other systems, but to date, we don't really have very good theory for doing that. Sustainable development, which has been the topic of most of this meeting, has to focus on the macroscopic features of ecosystems and environmental systems more generally, while recognizing that these emerge from microscopic interactions. As in this picture here, we have a challenge much like was faced in physics, but much harder, as to how to scale from the individual components and their interactions with each other to the macroscopic properties of whole systems, recognizing that the macroscopic properties emerge from the microscopic properties, but that they can't be dependent on the fine details. So that introduces a number of mathematical challenges that are going to be the focus of what I want to talk about today. First of all, the development of a statistical mechanics of ecological communities, of human societies and their linkages, and of the biosphere. The illumination of the dynamics of collective phenomena, and especially collective decision-making. The identification of indicators of when a system's about to lose resilience or robustness, the indicators of impending critical transitions between states, and of the mechanisms that underlie robustness and resilience. And here I want to make the point that it's not always the case that the loss of resilience is a bad thing. Sometimes you're in a state that you don't want to be in, trying to improve things, but still you're interested in when you're getting close. What are the indicators of change? And finally, and most crucially perhaps, and we've heard a lot about this, especially today, what are the pathways to achieving cooperation in the global commons that we all live in, and adaptive approaches to management of our complex adaptive world, as Bill Clark just told us about. So let me take these one at a time. The development of statistical mechanics of ecological communities, of human societies, and the biosphere. This is a great systems challenge, involves crossing scales from individuals to populations and societies, from evolution to ecology to physics, integrating human and environmental systems. And this is not new. There have been lots of efforts, for example, in ecology, the individual-based simulators of forest ecosystems and agent-based approaches to other systems, and much of that is going on at IIASA. And methods for simplifying these, because after all, building a simulation model limits your understanding of the system unless you can reduce the dimensionality, create the macroscopic description through approaches like coarse graining. For some of the problems I'll tell you about today, moving from a Lagrangian approach, which follows individuals, to an Eulerian approach, which describes the sort of field theory of individual interactions, moment closure schemes, and so-called equation-free methods that Yanis Kevrikides and others have been developing as ways to help us to simplify these complex, large-scale systems and get reduced dimensional descriptions of them. And one of the things we need to recognize, as Stephen Jay Gould pointed out, if the tape of evolution were run again, it wouldn't look exactly the same. We can't expect to predict the dynamics of every species exactly. For example, Mick Follows and his group have been modeling the distribution of organisms lower trophic levels in the oceans. They don't try to predict, they're not able to predict where every species will go. This is based on essentially individual-based approaches, but they can, as is in this simulation here, tell you where particular ecotypes are, where Prochlorococcus will be found, where the diatoms will be found, etc. So we have to understand at what level we can expect to predict, and we have to continue to develop these sorts of methods. Much of this involves understanding scaling from individuals to collectives and the dynamics of groups, whether you're dealing with zooplankton or whether you're dealing with humans and societies. And so the next challenge is the dynamics of collective phenomena and collective decision-making, ranging from these fantastic videos sent to me by Claudio Carreri of starlings in Rome. You can, if you've ever taken a course in fluid dynamics, you can't look at those individuals moving around and not think, this looks a lot like a fluid, we should be able to describe it in that way, to the much harder problem of describing the dynamics of individuals, not just in their movements, but in their opinion dynamics. Which leads to challenges in the modeling of the dynamics of voting systems. And I'm not sure all those P's got in there as they tried to achieve consensus, but that's what you get for changing your lecture at the last minute. Modeling the dynamics of voting and consensus. This is a paper that we published a few months ago, Ian Cousin in the lead, about trying to understand how consensus is reached in animal groups as well as in systems of humans. Modeling the dynamics of social norms. We just heard from Carl Sigman how one develops schemes of enforcement and punishment. Ernst Fehr, whom you see in the upper left here, has carried out groundbreaking research in which he's done experiments with individuals that describe the emergence of enforcement systems, learning that humans will indeed punish others who deviate from social norms, even at cost to themselves. Carl gave us an example of how this can work. Punishment itself is a norm, and it can evolve from repeated interactions. Carl Sigman's example, his model, is another example of this. Ecosystems as the biosphere, as Bill Clark told us, are complex systems. In particular, they are complex adaptive systems, which means they're made up of individual agents that interact with each other, and based on those interactions, behaviors change, and there are emergent patterns which ultimately feed back to affect those. And this has to influence how we design management schemes. But not only ecosystems and the biosphere are complex adaptive systems. Bill mentioned the adaptive component, but he also mentioned that the adaptive component is at lower levels of organization, at the levels of individuals and interactions. That doesn't imply that the system is adapting in ways that are good for the system. Not only are ecosystems complex adaptive systems, but so too are the socio-economic systems with which they are interlinked. And so this introduces some challenge. How can we understand these ecosystems and these socio-economic systems, and are there indicators of impending critical transitions between states. Nearly 5 years ago, about 6 months before the economic collapse that some of you may have heard of, Bob May and George Sugihara and I published a paper in Nature. I emphasize this is 6 months before the collapse. It was called Ecology for Bankers. And in it we said, it looks to us, not knowing anything, that banking systems are a lot like food webs in ecological systems, highly connected and getting more connected. And since many of these food webs are prone to collapse, why aren't the banking systems? For example, we said, who knows how the present concern over subprime loans will pan out? Well, I wish I had not only written this paper, but read it and done something about it. But it's an indicator that systems that are this complicated, as they become more and more overconnected, have the potential for collapse. This is not a new idea. Buzz Holling introduced in a paper about 35 years ago or more the notion of resilience and stability in ecological systems. And that picture you see describes what Buzz's ideas were. The idea is you had different basins of attraction, and you should be concerned not just, or maybe not even exclusively, but primarily with whether systems were going to tend back to equilibrium points, but whether they had the potential to get pushed out of basins of attraction entirely, or indeed whether as slow variables change, those basins of attraction might erode altogether. My student Carla Staver and I have been working on the forest-savanna boundary, primarily in South Africa, but looking at remote sensing data for the whole globe. And there are areas of the world where one should expect to see forest based on precipitation and temperature. And there are areas where one should be seeing savannas. But it turns out there are areas that are bistable, where it's not clear whether you should get forest or savannas. And our interpretation of what's going on there, and we've modeled this, is that it's because of fire. It's a dynamical system. Grass promotes fire. That keeps the trees from getting established, but once they get established, they provide an alternative stable state. This is a lot like the idea that Buzz was talking about. Changes in precipitation can drive system flips, and the picture looks a lot like pictures that you've perhaps seen in other systems. There are two potential equilibria, one sitting up here on the high end of the curve and one on the lower end of the curve, and the system can be flipped from one to the other, and once it is, it's very difficult to return it. In other words, savannas represent a stable alternative to forest with a long-term persistence that's maintained by fires. Martin Skeffer and Steve Carpenter and others have shown the same thing in shallow lake systems. And Buzz Holling and Don Ludwig and Dixon Jones, as well as Bill Clark, worked on spruce budworm systems. So any pest system or disease system has this potential for outbreaks and collapse. So this is a very important concept, that systems can suddenly, as they get near the edges of these regions of stability, be more susceptible to collapse. And many such transitions have characteristic signals that are just beginning to be identified. They've been identified certainly in phase transitions in physics for a long time, but extending these ideas to these more complex systems is a relatively new area. A concept called critical slowing down. The system's tendency to return to equilibrium becomes eroded. Increasing variance, increasing autocorrelation, and what's called flickering between systems, between the multiple states. And these ideas have gotten a lot of currency lately. There have been a series of papers, the most recent of which we just published in Science on Friday, called Anticipating Critical Transitions. This is a wonderful research area for IIASA, and in fact, there is work going on. The final thing I want to talk about is how we can achieve cooperation in the global commons. You've already seen Lynn Ostrom's picture. We all miss her. And Garrett Hardin is the one who popularized the notion, actually due to William Forster Lloyd, and called the tragedy of the commons, namely that when we're dealing with a common situation where we all have an interest in sustaining something, but none of us may have a sufficient incentive to do our parts, How do we get there? The answer, which you've already heard today, is mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. This introduces game theoretic problems, problems of understanding cooperation, how do you get insurance agreements, the importance of discounting, the role of uncertainty and private information, and the sorts of modeling as to how one gets agreements that has always been a part of IIASA. Indeed, ever since Howard Rafa founded it, this was right in the midst of Howard's own interests. There's a lot of work on this. A book, for example, here by Lynn Ostrom and Marco Janssen and Amy Poteet working together. We've done work, this is with my former student Alessandro Tavani and postdoc Maya Schluter, now at the Stockholm Resilience Center, on withdrawals from a common pool resource, for example, a water reservoir. Some individuals withdraw at prudent rates, others withdraw at higher rates, but those who withdraw at lower rates establish a norm by which they punish, they ostracize the others. And indeed, we show that it's possible to establish a norm structure in this way. Another good example for me, because I've worked on it, is the sharing of grazing grounds among pastoralists. These are individuals, especially in Kenya and East Africa more broadly, who need a place to graze their cattle. But if I have a bad year and you have a good year in terms of weather conditions, I ask, can I send my cattle to you to graze on your land? And you say, why should I do that? And I say, well, because if the situation's reversed next year, you can send cattle back to me. So this is an insurance arrangement. It's a form of cooperation. And we set up a mathematical model for this. I won't take you through it. And find out what the social optimum would be. If I were in charge and moving cattle around, what would be best in terms of the total utility? But then one has to ask, is this stable in a game theoretic sense? Is it self-enforcing? And of course, the discount rate is key. Depends how much you care about next year. And what if it's not stable? Well, then are there second best solutions by which I say, okay, I'll only send 10 of my cattle and you can send me 10 next year. Is that a stable arrangement? It's a constrained optimization problem. And finally, there's what in economics is called the mechanism design problem. Namely, what if I don't know what your other options are and I'm bargaining with you? How do we reach agreement? Again, always been a focus at IIASA. So I think the pastoral insurance example is of interest in itself, but more broadly because it's a model for addressing cooperation and especially international cooperation. Modeling the construction of stable regional and international agreements is a fundamental systems challenge addressing problems of risk management. I recommend to you this wonderful book by my friend and colleague, Scott Barrett, who served on the U.S. National Member Organization for IIASA, called Why Cooperate? Establishing Global Environmental Agreements. So let me conclude. I think the challenges for systems analysis going forward will of course include the ones I identified at the beginning in dynamical systems theory, optimization, and control, but it would also include new approaches to scaling from the microscopic to the macroscopic, the development of early warning indicators of critical transitions in these complex systems, lessons for the design of adaptive management, especially in the face of uncertainty, game theoretic methods for dealing with global cooperation, including, as we heard mentioned in the previous presentations, pro-sociality, that is caring for others, mechanism design for achieving cooperation, and finally, as Carl Sigmund told us, the emergence of the social contract itself. So I think there are lots of challenges going forward. Thank you.